Now it's time to bring back my good friend and co-host, Jeff Small, along with a new friend of the income generation, Gregory Daco. He's the U.S. Chief Economist at Oxford Economics. Greg, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, hey, I know back in April, you thought that the impacts of this economic shutdown was going to be just the tip of the iceberg and it was going to get a lot worse. As you sit here now, 3 months later, what are your thoughts?
I think we were proven largely right in the sense that this great coronavirus recession has hit the U.S. economy and the global economy with tremendous force. What we were seeing in late March was really the tip of the iceberg in terms of the pullback in consumer spending activity, in business investment activity, and overall in demand. We were hopeful that we were seeing the initial signs of a rather strong recovery since the latter portion of April and into late June, but we are seeing some signs of a plateauing with the health situation deteriorating in a number of states, and that to us is a source of concern. So
I've got to ask you this question. So, because you're a new guest, we tend to haze our new guests, kind of like a fraternity, just a little, so bear with me here. If I were to push you for a number, what do you think we're going to see at the beginning of August when the second quarter GDP report comes out? Some Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley was talking negative 35%, negative 40% GDP second quarter. What do you personally think? If you had to pick a number and guess, what do you think that number would be in the second quarter?
Well, I like to think that it's more than a guess. We actually have a global economic forecast that we utilize to produce these growth estimates and these outlooks. I think one thing that's really interesting and important to understand when you think about the coronavirus recession is the speed at which things are developing. The drop in activity was extremely rapid, unprecedented in terms of the magnitude, but the rebound was also very quick. And so whereas a month and a half ago, we were expecting a contraction in the second quarter around 40% annualized. That's not a simple term number. It's an annualized number of 40%. We're now looking at a contraction around 30%. Now, in simple terms, that would mean a contraction around 8-9% from where we were at the end of the first quarter. That's still a significant plunge and would be one of the worst quarters in history, if not the worst quarter reading in history.
Wow. Well, I have to tell you, you're going to be shocked by this, but you out-doomed and gloomed last week's guest, Dr. Mark Faber. He, author of the Doom, Gloom, and Boom report. He actually thought second quarter was going to be about a minus 20%. So you out-doomed and gloomed Dr. Mark Faber. I don't even know what to say about that, but it almost doesn't matter because, Jeff, I know you've got some questions lined up for Greg about the stock market. We've covered the economy. Let's talk about the stock market then.
Well, I'd be happy to do that, Dave, but I think Greg is on it. Everything that Greg is saying is probably more accurate than what Dr. Faber said. No disrespect to him, but I'm more aligned with Greg. And so, Greg, I was reading one of your tweets today, and you're seeing what's happening with the national economic reports. The rebound is pretty strong. And so did I hear you say that you think the annualized rate in GDP will be down 8% year over year as a result of the corona event? Or where do you see the economy actually ending up over the next year in terms of a total GDP percentage?
Well, I think that's very important to take a look at. When you're looking at any economic shock of this magnitude, you have to be able to take a step back from what's happening in the very near term. What we're seeing today with a lot of real-time data is that we're already in the early stages of a recovery. We've already gained back some of the losses in terms of consumer spending, in terms of business investment, and in terms of industrial production. But we're still a long ways away from where we were in the pre-COVID economy. So if you look at the broad economy, the US economy from a broad sense of the term, we're looking at a contraction this year that would be around 4% for the year as a whole. But that factors an initial peak to trough decline in overall economic output of about 10%, and then a partial rebound in the second half of the second quarter, but also going into the third and fourth quarter. As I noted earlier, I think a big risk is the risk of a double dip recession, because we are seeing in the real-time data some signs of plateauing in employment, some signs of plateauing in mobility and in demand, as the health situation has not been managed so far.
Now, Greg, hold on a second. Did I hear you straight that you were thinking we'd actually see a 4% shrinkage before the whole COVID crisis hit?
No, before the COVID crisis hit, we were looking at a 2% growth rate. But in an environment in which we have this COVID recession, we're looking at a 4% contraction in economic activity on average over 2020, and about a 3.9% rebound in 2021. And while these numbers appear the same, the growth accounting means that by the latter part of 2021, will we only regain the levels of output that we were experiencing pre-COVID. So this is going to be a protracted recovery. It's not going to happen overnight. And anybody that's thinking about this V-shaped recovery, I think is largely misguided, because yes, the initial phase of the rebound has been rapid, supported in part by some fairly strong fiscal and Fed stimulus measures. But going forward, the economy is going to have less juice, less energy, especially if we see some of the fiscal aid expiring, and that could represent a risk going into next year.
Yeah, it's always a wild card whether we get more aid or not. Greg, we need to take a quick commercial break, but please stay with us. We'll be back in a moment to ask you about the markets and lots of other great questions. And you stay with us too. We'll be back here in a moment on the income generation. We'll be right back. Now it's time to bring back my good friend and co-host Jeff Small, along with our new friend, Gregory Daco, the U.S. Chief Economist at Oxford Economics. Greg, thanks for sticking around.
My pleasure.
So I get it. Year over year, we do better third quarter, fourth quarter. So for 2020, we see 4% shrinkage. It takes all of 2021 to gain it back. So we're underwater essentially for another 18 months or so. So now I'm going to try again to hand it back to my beloved co-host, Jeff Small, because I know he does have some questions about the stock market and your thoughts on that as a result of this 18-month projection. Jeff?
Well, I do have questions about the market, but we beat up the market so much. Really what I want to tap into is Greg's dynamic or his genius on employment, because corporations are downsizing, America is being digitized, people are working from home, and there's lots of furloughs going on. It's almost like corporate America is bracing for the economic shock that's going to occur. So what's your projection with the economy on employment, Greg? What are you guys looking at? What are your reports and your feelers telling you there on employment going forward over the next 12 to 24 months?
If anything, our projection for the labor market is actually much more restrained than our projection for economic growth, because we think that a lot of the jobs that are being lost and have been lost are going to turn out to be more permanent job losses. There's a lot of talk about a lot of these job losses being temporary job losses, and that once the economy reopens, we'll see businesses rehiring. But that omits a couple of important elements. It omits the fact that in the meantime, demand has fallen quite sharply, and that we've also had a lot of fiscal stimulus to support the employment picture and prevent an even deeper trough in terms of overall employment. So if you look at the broad picture today, we're still down 15 million jobs from where we were back in February. That's better than the 20 plus million that we had lost in April, but it's still a very, very large numbers. And if you look at if you add into that number the self-employed and independent workers, we currently have 30 million people claiming unemployment benefits. So the situation is going to take a long time, and I wouldn't be surprised that we're talking years before we reclaim the 2019 Q4 levels of employment instead of just a few months.
So how can we have that big of an economic recovery through 2021 then? Is it because the folks that have money are out there willing to spend it? You know, is it the haves that can make up for maybe some of the have-nots, some of the people that maybe were in the lower income categories that lost their jobs are going to take a while to retool?
Well, I think it partially relies on the fact that we expect to see ongoing fiscal stimulus for the economy. One of the interesting dynamics and somewhat of a paradox in this recovery is the fact that the rebound in consumer spending has actually been led by lower income families, not the higher income families. And the key reason why is that a lot of these families benefited from substantial fiscal aid, the checks that were mailed out, the unemployment benefits, and a number of other measures that have helped support spending for these low income families. On the contrary, the high-income families have actually not really been able to spend on what they usually spend on, which is discretionary activities and a lot of service sector activities. That segment has actually remained quite short of what we saw before the COVID crisis, whereas low family incomes are more or less spending what they used to be spending on, which is a lot of the essential goods that they typically spend on.
That's the one of the things that makes your job and our job so hard, is it's really a question of, how much help we're going to get from Congress on an ongoing basis, how much help we get from the Fed on an ongoing basis. And the Fed's been blamed really or given credit for this rapid recovery in the stock market. So since Jeff won't play ball with me, I have to ask you, were you surprised by how quickly the stock market recovered at least most of its lost ground?
Well, in retrospect, you always have 20/20 hindsight, right? But I think what we have to consider in terms of the stock market is how strong and how rapid the Fed response was to this crisis. The Fed really led the charge globally and domestically in terms of providing assistance to the economy. That was through a number of measures, cutting interest rates, re-implementing open-ended QE, relaunching a number of emergency facilities. And yes, there is a very strong put on financial markets, but we should not forget that had the Fed not intervened, we would have seen an even deeper crisis because we would have seen a financial meltdown. And that's exactly what the Fed was trying to prevent at the time. Now, is there going to be some lingering Fed put going forward? Yes, certainly. And I think that's perhaps a large reason why we're seeing this disconnect between what's happening on Wall Street in financial markets and on Main Street in terms of the still lingering shortfalls relative to pre-COVID levels of activity.
So if not this recession, then maybe the next recession, sometime in the next 10 years or so. Do you think we'll see negative interest rates here in the United States? Yes or no?
I don't think so. I think that the Fed will want to use other tools before it thinks about negative interest rates. I think the FOMC committee was very clear back in October of last year, noting that they weren't necessarily convinced the value added of negative interest rates. And in the current environment, to be honest, I don't know that there is really a strain in terms of the cost of capital. I think what's important, perhaps more important in the current context, is ensuring that there is proper guidance as to the forward guidance for the Fed policy. And I think we're seeing a lot of reflection happening at the Fed as to what the next steps might be. Those might involve yield curve control, so controlling interest rates along the middle part of the yield curve, and adding to that a mix of forward guidance that may be actually based on either date or outcomes in terms of economic data. We saw this last week that the Bank of Canada actually adopted a forward guidance stance that said that as long as inflation didn't reach the 2% target and the output gap was closed, we wouldn't see any tightening of monetary policy. Could the Fed move in that direction?
And Gregory,
that's much more likely.
Unfortunately, we need to leave it there. We're out of time. But Gregory Daco, thanks so much for joining us today. At least our income generation members, our savers, will be happy to hear they don't have to face negative interest rates. Gregory, thank you. All right, you stay with us. We'll be right back in a moment here on the Income Generation.